Good evening. Thank you to Gregor Kitsis for that performance of the Bach Solo Violin Sonata. I'm Diane Sayre, and welcome to the New York Symposium with Diane Sayre. I am the LaRouche candidate for U.S. Senate against Chuck Schumer, and I will be joined this evening by two guests. William Schmidt, who is the Libertarian candidate for New York State Comptroller, and also by Paul Gallagher, who is the economics editor for Executive Intelligence Review. And there we are. And what we will be discussing this evening is the Federal Reserve, and also, if we get rid of the Federal Reserve, what to do, why should we get rid of it, what is it, and how to actually organize the recovery. And I would say we are in an absolutely spectacular existential crisis where on the one hand, we are facing threats of thermonuclear war, uh, not to be diminished by the ridiculous public service announcement from the city of New York, which people have seen, which is if a nuclear bomb hits Manhattan, be sure to go inside, close your windows, make sure you take off your irradiated clothing and put them away in bags and listen to the radio, as if anyone would be able to do any of that if a nuclear bomb hit New York City. But the threat of nuclear war is very dangerous, very real, even by accident, because we are so much on the cusp and we have basically closed all diplomatic channels of communication between the United States and Russia. And if we continue with our provocations of China, that may also occur. Now, on China, Nancy Pelosi has been threatening to go to Taiwan. I don't know if that trip has been canceled yet. I thought the response of the Chinese Foreign Ministry was very telling, because they said that since Nancy Pelosi is in the line of succession to become president of the United States, her visit to Taiwan would be seen differently than others or just some other member of Congress, and China would respond accordingly. Biden reported that the military doesn't think it's a good idea, the U.S. military doesn't think it's a good idea for Pelosi to go. Hopefully she'll cancel her trip. But I think it also underscores what we are not supposed to discuss in the United States, but what is clearly obvious to the world is that we have a president not only who has COVID, but who is suffering from dementia, is very frail, and there is reason to wonder whether he has the strength to make it until January of 2025 and who really is running the country. So clearly that's obvious to other heads of state, other governments and nations, and I think it must be a cause of great concern that you have a nation with the size of nuclear arsenal that we do, and we have the current leadership, the whole administration. Now, otherwise, on this blowout, look, Boris Johnson is out. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't sound like the replacement for him is going to be any better, could possibly be worse if that's imaginable. But the point is he's out. Mario Draghi is now officially out, even though he did some very megalomaniacal operation to get himself a confidence vote, even though a whole chunk of the parliament walked out. And then resigned, but there's going to be snap elections called in Italy. And now the European Central Bank is announcing a 0.5% rate increase in interest rates. This will be the end of the negative interest rates for the first time in 8 years. But of course, the danger is that if you do this, many banks could possibly default. So what are we going to do? Well, they're setting up a new program called the Transmission Protection Instrument. And no, that's not something for your automobile, although it sounds like it ought to be. Maybe we should have the local auto body shop selling transmission protection instruments to people who drive, but somehow more playing with money. The point is, and as Lyndon LaRouche developed in his expertise in physical economy, there is nothing to be solved in this crisis by managing money, raising the interest rates, lowering the interest rates, printing more money, printing less money. The problem is physical. Are we increasing mankind's power over nature? Are we producing the physical goods that are needed for human beings to exist? Food, clean drinking water. Do we have enough electricity? We saw, I showed the other night in a meeting of activists, a video from Texas where you had a line 3 miles long of cattle farmers to sell off their herds because we have no water management. So you get a heat wave, you have terrible drought, they can't take care of the herd, and they can't afford hay because of the hyperinflation. So our entire food supply is in jeopardy. Who is going to address that? Will raising the interest rates give us more beef? How about lowering the interest rates? No, it's not going to be solved in that domain. That's what people have to face. The entire system is bankrupt. and has to be restructured. Now, I bring that up in this context because it's only in such a moment when everything is at stake that you can get the changes that are urgently needed. And I think that's why this example of the Treaty of Westphalia from 1648, which ended the 30 years religious war, which is really about 150 years of religious war, is such an important thing to reflect upon, because people say, well, how can you ever get peace? We'll never get peace between Israel and the Palestinian people. We're never going to, we always have to have an enemy. We're not going to stop fighting Russia and China. It's going to be going on forever. Well, imagine what went on in a religious war. If you know what religious wars are like: torture, chopping people's arms and legs off. If you see paintings from the late 1600s of Europe, you see all these people in there who are missing arms and legs. The legacy of that was totally destructive. And it dawned on people that if they continued in this way, there would be nothing left. And therefore, an extraordinary agreement was made, which involved a number of things. One was debt forgiveness, so that the warring parties could actually get their economies going to care for their population, and that every nation, every city-state, every group involved would act from the standpoint of the interest of the other. And people today would say, oh, that's too good, forget it. No one today would ever do that. That's impossible. Well, I don't know. The 30 Years' War was pretty bloody and pretty bad, and people somehow managed to agree that they weren't going to continue that way. No retribution, draw a line, we're not looking back, and we're changing the policy. You can't get that type of change until everything else fails. And the good news and the bad news is we're about at that point. Now, there's been one very interesting breakthrough, which is on the question of grain. As people may be aware, the World Food Program leader, David Beasley, has warned that as many as 1.7 billion people on the planet may be facing famine due to the sanctions, supposedly because of what they call Russia's unprovoked military invasion of Ukraine, which is a total lie to call it that. But at any rate, so you have a situation where Russia and Ukraine, between them, produced 30% of the world's wheat exports, for example, obviously severely disrupted. So an agreement has been reached where both Russia and Ukraine negotiated not with each other, but with Turkey and with the United Nations. And so the infrastructure minister of Ukraine and Turkey's defense minister signed, I guess yesterday, in the presence of the UN Secretary General Guterres and Erdogan, an agreement that 3 Ukrainian ports will be opened up to allow grain to leave Ukraine to get to places that need it. And they are calling them safe corridors. They say they're not going to demine the ports, but they will know the safe corridors. I find that a little alarming, because my understanding is a lot of the mines that Ukraine put out in the Black Sea were very old and their chains broke, and this is why the Russians had such a job to run around and try and demine the place and make it possible for ships to get in and out. But at any rate, there's going to be a control and coordination center in Istanbul to be staffed by the UN, Russian, Turkish, and Ukrainian officials to handle all aspects of this operation. This is fascinating. It's a small step, but it demonstrates that when there is an outcry, when people say this cannot be accepted, we're not going to sit idly by, sit on our hands and allow millions or billions of people to die of starvation. And the shame, how could Ukraine continue to assert that it's the great democratic nation that it's claiming to be, if it was going to be complicit in this blockade of urgently needed food? So in a sense, there was a forcing mechanism. There was shame, which caused people to act. I'm not saying this means the war is over by any means. I'm just saying it indicates the nature of the moment that we're in, the potential for change. And that is exactly what we have to bring about. And that is exactly why I launched this campaign against Senator Chuck Schumer. So, with that, I would like to turn it over to William. Why don't you go ahead?
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be able to join you tonight, and congratulations on achieving ballot status. That was an awesome accomplishment. We're still duking it out with them in the courts, and hopefully we'll be successful. But in the meantime, I'm doing what I can, get my message out to New Yorkers. It's one of the things that I want to bring to people's attention is how important the office of New York State Comptroller is. The Comptroller is the manager of a pension fund that's worth more than $250 billion. And the Comptroller also audits every dollar that comes into New York State's budget and every dollar that goes out that New York State spends, as well as every subdivision of New York, every city, town, county, sewer district, fire district, all those little fiefdoms that the states created, like the Empire State Development Corporation, which love to give tax giveaways to wealthy corporations and developers like the Buffalo Bills. And one of the things that I've noticed, I've been around the block for quite a while. I'm 67 years old. I served as a city councilman here in Peekskill for 8 years. I worked for the New York State Insurance Department in senior management. I worked in the private sector for an insurance agency and helped set up a 401k plan for our employees. So I'm fairly familiar with budgets and money and how the policies of the federal government in general and the Federal Reserve in particular affect pensions and people's personal finances. And when I talk to people, the common response that I get is people understand that something is wrong in the country today, financially, not to mention in other issues, but particularly with respect to financial issues. They're not quite sure what the problem is, but people in their gut know that something is wrong. I've been observing this history for a very long time, for decades, and it's very clear to me what the problem is. The problem is the Federal Reserve, which is public enemy number one. That's what I call them. They're engineering the greatest financial fraud in human history through their policies of negative interest rates and quantitative easing and inflation targets. What those things represent is a transfer of wealth from lower income and middle income people to the wealthiest strata of society. How do they do that? They do that by keeping interest rates below market, artificially low interest rates. In fact, they've kept them so low that interest rates are now negative. So we now have the insane situation where you pay people to borrow money from you. That is the most preposterous thing that I've ever heard. The Federal Reserve has created that within the last 10 years. That's something that never existed before in human history, and it exists now. The other thing that the Federal Reserve does, which amounts to financial fraud, is what they call quantitative easing, where they create cash out of thin air, pump it into the banking system. In many instances, they loan this money, this so-called money, it's really currency. They loan it to the banking system at artificially low rates. The banks then in turn use that money to lend out money to other people, including the poor middle class working guy who takes out a credit card debt and pays the bank 20% interest. This is debt slavery. This is what the Federal Reserve has created in the 110 years that it's existed. We have been converted from a society that's based on wealth to a society that's based on debt. The debt is now growing exponentially. If this is a situation now, the debt is so huge between off-balance sheet liabilities plus what the government keeps on its books, which is over $30 trillion and growing. This is a debt that's so huge that it can never be repaid. So the Federal Reserve is engaging in more chicanery. They're going to continue to keep interest rates artificially low. They're going to continue to print more artificial currency, put it into the financial system. This will cause greater wealth inequality. This will cause homelessness because what they've done when people borrow money at artificially low interest rates, usually the wealthy, that pumps up all the assets in the economic system. That pumps up stock equities, that pumps up real estate, that pumps up bonds. All of those assets are now in an artificial bubble, and that bubble will eventually burst. When that bubble bursts, people's 401ks will decline, the pension system will decline, and people are going to get hurt in a very dramatic way. So my purpose in running for this office is to alert New Yorkers and even the American people to the degree that these type of broadcasts go out countrywide, because this is something that's really of concern to everybody. I want to alert people as to what's happening, why it's happening, and what we can do about it. And the next step after this, what they will do is they will replace the current fiat currency system that we have with a central bank digital currency, which is a system of total financial control. All of your financial assets will be in digital form. The government will have total control over everything that you spend. If they don't like what you're spending, they can shut you down, just like the Trudeau regime did in Canada to the Canadian truckers. They can prevent you from going to a protest. They can prevent you from gassing up your car. They can prevent you from buying an airline ticket. If they think you're spending too much money on cigarettes, they can prevent you from doing that. They can also do something even more insidious. If they feel that the economy is in a slump and people aren't spending too much, they can make your money in your checking account diminish in value. They can say if you don't spend it within a month, it's going to decline by, say, 2% or maybe 5% or even 10%. This is theft on a grand scale, and it's total financial tyranny. This is what the Federal Reserve is leading us to, and we must unite together to put a stop to it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It would be very good if the voters of New York had you in that office of New York State Comptroller, because I think we'd learn a lot about what's actually going on here in this state. Many things that should be audited. Paul Gallagher of Executive Intelligence Review, please go ahead. You're muted. Paul?
Sorry.
Great.
These issues of how the Federal Reserve is doing what it's doing to us and to our economy are difficult to understand. And so I think it's better to, or I prefer to start from the solution, which I believe is not to simply get rid of, eliminate the Federal Reserve so that there was no national banking institution of the United States, but rather for the Congress of the United States. Obviously, the executive is involved in organizing for this, but as everybody knows, the Federal Reserve is not an institution controlled either by the presidency or by the Congress. It is, quote unquote, independent, but in fact acts as a servant of not just the banking system, but only the largest of the banks among them. And it has made those banks immeasurably larger than the too big to fail giants they already were before the 2008 crash. So it's not under control. The solution begins by the Congress, through legislation, nationalizing that bank, throwing out its existing board of governors, and at least vetting most of the regional presidents and replacing most of them, and changing the mandate of the Federal Reserve entirely to the mandate which was given to the national banks of the United States, the first national bank created by Alexander Hamilton, the second national bank in the 1820s and 30s, helmed by Biddle and Nicholas Biddle, which was an absolute dynamo of credit growth and income equality at the same time in the United States in that period. And the system of national banks that was created for the first time by Abraham Lincoln through the 1863 and 1864 Banking Acts, which put a clamp on the securities operations of the banks, made sure that they were not permitted to act as broker-dealers or engage in securities speculation. In other words, the 1864 Act in particular looked forward to the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933, and for the limited banking system of that time, did the same thing. It limited the banks to lending, and it brought those banks into a correspondence with the Treasury where they were responsible for buying treasury debt and for circulating currency for productive purposes, the so-called greenback currency issuances. That principle of credit for production, not credit directed to banks, and particularly not to the big mega banks of Wall Street and London, but rather credit directed to businesses, to municipal agencies, to states, to agencies created in order to develop regions. And by this I mean all over the world. Tennessee Valley authorities, which should be by agreement among such national banks, those Tennessee Valley authorities should be being created all over the world at this point. That's what Lyndon LaRouche meant when he talked about a new system based on Franklin Roosevelt's Bretton Woods system, one which, not the way it worked out, but the way Roosevelt intended it, one that would make itself responsible for the credit for development, let us say, of the Tennessee valleys all over the world. And that administration did studies of river valleys all over the world. Look, there's nothing conceivably more important right now than the mastery and management of water. And this goes for this country, which is losing the western half of North America progressively to desertification and losing it to food production, because for 40 years we have been looking at this process of desertification and doing nothing about developing the river valleys of the upper Mississippi, of the Missouri, and above all the river valleys in collaboration with Canada, the river valleys of Alaska and northern Canada, in order to actually do for the West what the Tennessee Valley Authority did for the Southeast. There's nothing more important to the survival of this country other than preventing nuclear war. Nothing more important than solving that problem. That takes credit. It takes a great deal of credit. And we have to have a national bank whose purpose is to put credit into that kind of productive development investment, not into the Wall Street banks. That's a simple matter of changing the charter and mandate of the Federal Reserve and enforcing that they implement that mandate and nothing else. Let me give you, Jose, if you could put up that graph that I had. I want to show the way the Fed does this. This is the banking system, the entire U.S. banking system. But and these are based on figures put out by the Federal Reserve every week, actually. But this is going back to 1997, which is about as far back as you can take this series. These are the deposits in the banking system and the loans in the banking system. Keep in mind that over the period we're going from 97 until December 21, the present period, the entire U.S. banking system has come to be dominated more than 75% by just 12 banks. So here we ain't talking about 5,000 banks. We're talking about a dozen banks. And really, we're talking about half a dozen that are located on Wall Street or were, and have now gotten even bigger and moved elsewhere, their headquarters. That's what this is. Now, look, 30 years ago or 25 years ago, and you could take this back for decades and decades before this as well, you would find the deposits in the banks and the loans outstanding from the banks would be just about the same. That's what they were in December of 1997. 3.1 trillion versus 3.05 trillion. 10 years later, 2007, the end of it, deposits 6.65 trillion, loans 6.80 trillion. It's essentially the same still. Bank assets would be somewhat larger than this, not a multiple of this by any means, but somewhat larger than this. But we're comparing the deposits and the loans. Now look at 10 years after that, December 2016. Suddenly the deposits are 2.5 trillion greater than the loans. 2.5 trillion of those deposits are being used for something other than loans and leases, something other than mortgages, something other than business loans, commercial loans. They're being used for speculation by the biggest banks. Look at December 2021, the tremendous change in that situation just in 5 years. Now there's 8 trillion more in deposits in the banking system than there are in loans and bank credit of all kinds, with one exception, and that is bank credit in securities, in speculating in securities. You're looking at two things here. You're looking, number one, at, on the right-hand side of that December 2021 graph, you're looking at the deposits of and savings of businesses, of households, the savings in pension funds, the investment funds that are available in our investment and invested. And in the left-hand column, you're looking at the workings of the Federal Reserve, because who provided the biggest banks with that $8 trillion of additional reserves, which they use for speculation and not for lending? The Federal Reserve did it, and they did it within a period of less than a decade, and they did it in a way which tremendously accelerated in the middle of 2019. In the middle of 2019, for 10 years, the Fed had printed, and this is how they do it, they create new electronic reserves, they call them, and they park them in the biggest banks, and only in the biggest banks. The rest of the banks don't even qualify to borrow this kind of thing from the Federal Reserve. And those banks then turn them into assets, securities assets, or lending assets if they choose part of them to turn them into lending assets. So in the 10 years up to the middle of 2019, from the crash to 2019, the Fed created nearly $3 trillion in new currency, new Wall Street bank reserves in that 10-year period of time. From the middle of 2019 to the middle of 2021, in just 2 years, the Federal Reserve created another 5.25 trillion. They were creating money in that 2 years at 10 times the rate of the entire quantitative easing period from 2009 to 2019. Why? Because the first period was sufficient. That's for 3 trillion. The Fed was joined by the Bank of Japan and the European Central Bank and the Bank of England, printing away. That was sufficient to build up a bubble of unpayable debt, especially corporate debt, on a global scale, debt that absolutely can never be paid and will never be paid, and had to collapse. In the middle of 2019, that collapse began. The big U.S. banks cut off all lending to the big European banks as a result of fears, they said, that the loans outstanding of the big European banks and the securities investments of those banks were unsound. In other words, the European banking system as a whole had a Lehman moment in the view of the Wall Street banks and they stopped lending. This was going to crash debt all over the world. The Federal Reserve jumped in there, started printing. They called this the repo crisis. It obscured what was really going on. They started printing money and printed it from mid 2019 up till the middle of 2021, late 2021, at a rate never approximated before, even during quantitative easing from 2009 to 2019. EIR was able to predict in the middle of 2021 this had already caused a raging commodity price inflation. So we were able to predict that it was now going to cause a runaway consumer price inflation, which of course is exactly what we have seen in the year or so since then. And then in the middle of that year, in March of this year, NATO intervened with the monster sanctions, the super sanctions against Russia, and literally crushed the world economy. Crushed it, absolutely, with those sanctions. So it was easy to forecast well before that there was going to be a recession. Once the NATO sanctions were placed on, it was clear that recession was going to hit this year, 2022, not out in 2025, where the pundits were placing it, but this year. And as of today, the Purchasing Managers Index of both Europe and the United States, among other indications, say that recession is here. It's going to be a very deep recession. We're already in it. The Federal Reserve, in effect, created it. And the recovery demands that we no longer have a Federal Reserve, that instead we have a national bank, a third national bank of the United States. How does Congress do that? It changes the management, throws out the management. It changes the mandate. It orders that the Federal Reserve sell off the $9 trillion of assets that it now has over a certain period, those assets it has because of the money printing. It orders that the Fed sell those off in a certain period of time, giving notice to every pension fund and every other investor in the country that all these speculative operations are going to go bankrupt. And this must be accompanied at the same time by passing a renewed Glass-Steagall Act, because all of that securities monstrosity in those casino banks of Wall Street has to be separated in the same period of time, call it 3 months, call it 6 months, has to be separated completely in the same period of time from the productive loans to households and businesses in those banks, their commercial banking business. Do that separation, and those speculative activities will go bankrupt. And the Federal Reserve being ordered, or the new National Bank of the United States, being ordered to quickly, in that period of time, sell off those assets, will make sure that they all go bankrupt. By comparison, the Federal Reserve is now supposedly tapering, right? It's supposedly selling off the $9 trillion asset book that it accumulated printing this money. So far, in 2 months, it has sold off less than $50 billion of that. That means it's at a pace to take about a decade to sell those, supposedly to run those assets off. It should be done in 3 months to 6 months so that people know this will be a bank whose purpose is to issue credit for production, and above all for infrastructure production, to raise the productivity of our economy, and for cooperation with the national banks of other major powers to invest in infrastructure and raise the productivity of countries across the developing sector in particular. And the kind of productive investments, well, I've already talked about that. The origin of this change in monetary policy, and it will have to be international. It will have to be by cooperation among major powers. The origin of it is very likely now to be in Eurasia. Everybody knows that the Eurasian countries are the biggest powers there, including India, China, Russia, and others, are discussing how can they arrange monetary affairs without the dollar. Well, they're wrong about that. They've got to arrange them with the dollar, but with a United States which changes its policy so as to cooperate in development projects in developing countries, especially in Eurasia, in Africa, in the Middle East and North Africa, and in South America. So that's where it's likely to, where the impetus for this is likely to originate. The United States has got to join it, and this policy of nationalizing the Federal Reserve is a step that we will take in joining in that new monetary system. And where does it come from? The idea comes from Lyndon LaRouche. Uh, I'll end just by noting that now in the media, among people who read about these kinds of things, they are reading a lot about a fellow named Sergei Glasiev, a Russian who has big plans for the Eurasian countries forming a new monetary system. 20 years ago, we'll be publishing an EIR this coming week. 20 years ago, that same Sergei Glasiev invited Lyndon LaRouche to come to Moscow with Helga Zepp-LaRouche and the two of them to address the State Duma, the national legislature of Russia, at a time when Vladimir Putin had just become president of Russia. And Sergei Glasiev wanted to highlight Lyndon LaRouche's new Bretton Woods idea for the lawmakers of Russia at that time. So this coming week's EIR will be publishing that whole story, including what Lyndon and Helga LaRouche said to the State Duma in late June of 2001 about this very plan, this very orientation. So I'm going to leave it there, but that's what I think we've got to do with the Federal Reserve before it blows up our entire economy in a hyperinflationary explosion.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you both. So first, let me ask William if you have any thoughts either on anything Paul said or questions or comments on anything else. You're muted. William, you're muted. We can't hear you.
Muted.
Jose, try again.
How's now?
Yes.
Good.
Okay.
All right. So I'm glad you both brought up the European Central Bank, the ECB, because it didn't get a lot of publicity except in some obscure portions of Bloomberg's website. Christine Lagarde held an emergency meeting of the ECB very recently, and they met to discuss what they called the fragmentation of the bond market. Now, that was a very antiseptic way of saying the bond market is collapsing. And to take all of this insanity that we've been talking about and carrying it to a step further, what the ECB is going to do is they're going to allegedly start raising interest rates like we're supposedly doing in an effort to combat inflation. And at the same time, they've implemented more quantitative easing, in other words, more expansion of the money supply. They said that they were going to use it unlimited. So to me, that's like driving a car off of a cliff with your left foot on the brake and your right foot on the accelerator. And that appears to be what they're headed for. And the only question is, are we going to be as stupid as they are? So I think we're all in accord about getting rid of the Fed as it currently exists. We as libertarians, of course, take a very different perspective as to what to do with it. We wouldn't replace it with anything. We believe that banking belongs to the American people. And just like any other business, whether it's groceries or retail, banking can be provided by people. It can be provided by the private sector. So I guess this is the old age-old debate. I'm a Jacksonian and you're a Hamiltonian, Paul. But that's what we're comfortable with. We favor decentralized finance. Our greatest worry about a national bank, I think you're well intentioned with it, and it certainly wouldn't be anything like what the Federal Reserve is doing. But anytime you put an entity in the control of politicians and bureaucrats, which is what essentially a national bank would be because it would be created by them, there's always the potential for mischief, for something like that to morph into something more nefarious than what you have in mind for it. So we have a legitimate philosophical debate about that. We believe it belongs in the private sector. I would say one thing, there is a role for the government in doing. The first thing that the Fed did that was bad before it even did negative interest rates and quantitative easing, when they first created it, they created a system of what they call fractional reserve banking. And what they basically said was banks only need to keep a fraction of what they should keep in reserve, which defies common sense. I mean, I worked in the insurance industry and I handled claims. We used to have to put aside reserves in a separate account to account for and address what we ultimately expected to pay out. And it's the same in the banking sector. So if you don't have proper reserves in the banking sector, you face when people want to take out their money en masse because there's an economic crisis, the banks won't be able to pay them. So we would eliminate fractional reserve banking. And one of the things that the government should be doing is making sure that banks are properly capitalized so that they can't engage in the type of idiocy that we've seen grow exponentially over the past 10 years.
Paul? Unmute.
I definitely don't want to believe that you're a Jacksonian because he has to claim credit for a 25-year period of real uh, productive collapse in the American economy. You know, the United States became the greatest industrial and scientific power in the world over a period of a century or so, with a real gap in that progress, and that gap was from the crash of 1937. Sorry, of course, I'm talking about the crash of 1837 up until the Civil War, and um, it was really the responsibility of Jackson's view. He claimed that he was against banks, but in fact, he was very cozy um, with the state banks, which were most of them engaged in one sort of fraudulent activity or another, and certainly were totally unregulated and didn't want to be regulated. Uh, he was very cozy with them uh, and wanted to destroy the Second National Bank. And what he brought on as a result was a crash which obliterated his successor, Martin Van Buren, who was never a political candidate again, and um, and really lasted for a long period of time, and in a very important way that John Quincy Adams foresaw at that time in 1837. Jackson guaranteed the coming on of the Civil War because by denying the nation of productive credit in an organized way, and productive credit for real progress has to come from a federal institution for real infrastructure development, scientific progress, going into space, the Tennessee Valley Authority, building nuclear power plants, new technologies, has to come from a federal institution. Jackson made sure that there was no federal institution which could do that. And we don't want to have that kind of situation now. Um, the Lincoln administration had a hard time reversing that, but they did. And as a result of doing that, with the greenbacks and with the banking acts of 63 and 64, they produced the greatest rate of progress that this nation has ever had from then until essentially until the First World War. So this is something, it used to be called the American system. It obviously has a central figure in Alexander Hamilton, but he's not by any means the only one or even the only source of this. There's Friedrich List, there's Gottfried Leibniz. There's discoveries about productive economic activity, which Hamilton was the beneficiary and used them. But it is very distinct from allowing a situation where we, for credit for development, have to depend on private banks. When we're in a situation like that, we don't progress. There may be stock market booms and busts. There may be industrial activity, but we don't progress when we have no national instrument of credit for development. So that's what I'd say to that. It's especially right now absolutely essential if you look at the condition of productive economies around the world. It's a cataclysm. It really is. And food production alone is going to have to be sustained with tremendous amounts of credit in order to avoid what David Beasley, the World Food Program, was talking about in Congress 2 days ago, that he expects by next year there will be an absolute worldwide food shortage. And that will mean automatic famine of hundreds of millions, because you can't move around food that doesn't exist, no matter how much logistics you may have. And that's what has farmers up in arms all over Europe and in the United States. They're supporting the farmers in Europe. That credit is essential.
There's one problem with that. The sovereign is bankrupt. So where are you going to get the money from other than to artificially create it out of thin air like the Fed is doing?
Well, there's no question that the United States government is not bankrupt. It's very far from bankrupt. I mean, that's simply a myth. The United States debt is eagerly sought. It's not just bought; it's eagerly sought. The United States government is playing with fire because of its policies and because of its attempt to throw everything into having a strong military and a weak everything else, which also has tremendous bad cultural impacts on the population, on young people in particular. It's a might makes right policy that the only thing we are is the strongest military government in the world. Otherwise, we're wretched. We're playing with fire.
I would take issue with that. I don't think U.S. debt is eagerly sought. The Chinese are already trying to get rid of it. The biggest buyer of United States debt is the Federal Reserve. They're buying their own garbage.
Well, the Chinese are so is Japan. There is,
and rightfully so.
Since March, there is obviously a fear that if you hold the reserves of your own central bank in U.S. credit instruments, the U.S. will seize them. It's impossible for countries to draw any other conclusion, and therefore they're trying to get them. That's exactly what I mean. The United States is absolutely playing with fire. It's making the dollar a weaponized currency, which if you use it, they may seize it. So it's creating the strongest possible disincentive or incentive for countries to get rid of dollar holdings. Nonetheless, they don't, not at any significant rate. And I mean, it's just the fact the United States Treasury could extend a good deal more credit than it has now in the form of bond issues, if those bond issues were tied to productive missions. I mean, we've certainly done this before. We had war bonds. We've had bonds that people understood were for purposes of production or survival. And if if bond issues like that will be bought by the public and by the institutions, the commercial banks and so on, and the pension funds, then the government has credit.
Yeah, and how were
If
those bonds after World War II paid off? They were paid off by inflating them away, the value. People lost 30% more during the inflation of the late 1940s. That was the only way they could pay them back.
Well, I think, that then we're getting into too much of a detailed debate about what happened. I'm talking about a general principle. That is, if a government can issue credit, can issue bonds with the consent of the governed, that is, that the people and the institutions who might invest understand and accept what those bond issues are for, they support them, they understand the missions they're for, they buy them, and that government has credit. If it over a period of time ruins that credit, it won't have it anymore. It's not just a matter of you can't print it like the Federal Reserve believes. Just print the money by fiat, and it must be accepted. It must be used because we printed it. That's not at all the case. And there is a responsibility to sovereignty and to sovereign credit that it has to be with the consent, ultimately, of the households, the citizens, the institutions of the country.
I'd just like to cut in here with something from Franklin Roosevelt from his 1936 acceptance speech at the Democratic Convention, because it is a problem when you have these mega banks running roughshod, and the question is who can rein them in. And the government does have the power to do it if it chooses to use it. But it's very striking if you look at that time. He says, that very word freedom in itself and of necessity suggests freedom from some restraining power. In 1776, we sought freedom from the tyranny of a political autocracy, from the 18th century royalists who held special privileges from the crown. It was to perpetuate their privilege that they governed without the consent of the governed, that they denied the right of free assembly and free speech, that they restricted the worship of God, that they put the average man's property and the average man's life in pawn to the mercenaries of a dynastic power, that they regimented the people. And so it was to win the freedom from the tyranny of political autocracy that the American Revolution was fought. That victory gave the business of governing into the hands of the average man, who won the right with his neighbors to make and order his own destiny through his own government. Political tyranny was wiped out at Philadelphia on July 4th, 1776. Since that struggle, however, man's inventive genius released new forces in our land which reordered the lives of our people. The age of machinery, of railroads, of steam and electricity, the telegraph and the radio, mass production, mass distribution, all of these combined to bring forward a new civilization, and with it a new problem for those who sought to remain free. For out of this modern civilization, economic royalists carved new dynasties. New kingdoms were built upon concentration of control over material things. Think about the monopolies we're seeing right now. Through new uses of corporations, banks, and securities, new machinery of industry and agriculture, of labor and capital, all undreamed of by the fathers, the whole structure of modern life was impressed into this royal service. There was no place among this royalty for our many thousands of small businessmen and merchants who sought to make a worthy use of the American system of initiative and profit. They were no more free than the worker or the farmer. Even honest and progressive-minded men of wealth, aware of their obligation to their generation, could never know just where they fitted into this dynastic scheme of things. It was natural and perhaps human that the privileged princes of these new economic dynasties, thirsting for power, reached out for control over government itself. They created a new despotism and wrapped it in the robes of legal sanction. In its service, new mercenaries sought to regiment the people, their labor, and their property. And as a result, the average man once more confronts the problem that faced the Minuteman. The hours men and women worked, the wages they received, the conditions of their labor, these had passed beyond the control of the people and were imposed by this new industrial dictatorship. The savings of the average family, the capital of the small businessman, the investments set aside for old age, other people's money, these were tools which the new economic royalty used to dig itself in. Those who tilled the soil no longer reaped the rewards which were their right. The small measure of their gains was decreed by men in distant cities. Throughout the nation, opportunity was limited by monopoly. Individual initiative was crushed in the cogs of a great machine. The field open for free business was more and more restricted. Private enterprise, indeed, became too private. It became privileged enterprise, not free enterprise. For too many of us, the political equality we had once won was meaningless in the face of economic inequality. A small group had concentrated into their own hands an almost complete control over other people's property, other people's money, other people's labor, other people's lives. For too many of us, life was no longer free, liberty no longer real, men could no longer follow the pursuit of happiness. Against economic tyranny such as this, the American citizen could appeal only to the organized power of government. The collapse of 1929 showed up the despotism for what it was. The election of 1932 was the people's mandate to end it. Under that mandate, it is being ended. And I think this is very powerful and reflects very much what we're dealing with. And the question is, who, if you just have everybody able to do whatever they want, then ultimately it's like Thrasymachus, whoever has the most money, the most power, ends up consolidating it. And in effect, the government we have now, you certainly can argue we have too many agencies and too much red tape and all kinds of bureaucratic monstrosities. But how has that come into being if not through this overgrowth of these private interests, not least of which is the Federal Reserve, but these big companies? If you look at our food supply, if you look at our manufacturing, all you have is monopolies, and or big tech, or how about the news media, or almost anything you can think of. It's a tiny group of millionaires and billionaires controlling it who really don't give a damn what happens to the population. And I don't know that there's a way to get that back under control except through government being able to do it. And of course, the people have to demand it. I think the population has been too complacent thus far. There are antitrust laws, there's all kinds of things that can be done, but it has to be demanded by the people.
I would take the opposite approach. I would say that allowing government to do favors to private corporations, the conspiracy that the government has entered into with the oligarchs, like, for example, the Federal Reserve, is the cause of the problem, and devolving government is the answer, not the problem.
But the question then is, how do you organize the credit that you need to do what's actually required on the scale that we need it?
Who determines what's the scale that we need? You may have a different view than I do.
I think
Well, That's very likely the case, but I think if you
Our perspective
consider,
as the marketplace should determine it.
no, well, I think that there's the moral question here, and it can't be arbitrary. That is, the measurement is the principle of the general welfare, which is what's in our Constitution. That is the standard of living rising? Is life expectancy increasing? Do people have more power to produce? Are we becoming more productive? I think these are the metrics, and that determines what's needed. Is it really right to allow the entire Midwest of our country to get destroyed by drought? And how can you organize the scale of water projects, for example, needed, which are across states, really across the whole continent, based on the markets? You won't be able to do it.
I mean, I think that
Paul, you're somehow quiet. I don't know.
well, mine
There we
doesn't
go.
show. Yeah, I think that it's pretty clear to people that the economy of the United States is failing them at this point, and that almost inconceivable problems like what were inconceivable a short time ago, like the inability of power to stay on when it's very hot, when it's very cold, the loss of life due to these power failures, the inability of food production to hold up, the shortages that appear in in every in the face of every small business and medium business, as well as in the face of consumers and in stores, the inability to transport goods across the country, the basically breakdown of rail transport, which has paralyzed a great deal of movement of goods in the out of the West Coast, and similar things like this, as well as the lack of young people having a sense of uh, productive future in front of them, um, is really bothering everyone. People understand it, but it's absolutely impossible to think of solving these things by leaving it up to private industry, or private business alone. And even private business will say that at this point, they can't solve these things. These the period in which uh, Roosevelt's view of infrastructure investment and of government responsibility obtained, and following it through the Kennedy administration and the intervening administrations, that is the period of the greatest productivity growth in all of American history that's known. Productivity is really the key to this. The economic productivity, including technological progress and labor productivity, is the key to solving all of these economic problems. And there's no period of productivity growth in American history, at least since 1870, since there are records of any kind, no period that corresponds or in any way equals the period roughly from the middle 1930s until the middle of the 1970s. That's called, for good reason, the golden age of productivity in the U.S. economy. And that is the period driven by this kind of national credit for the most important frontier projects of infrastructure, technology, and science, from projects like the TVA all the way through projects like Apollo, which took us to the moon, um, with the Manhattan Project and others in between, apparently extremely difficult crash programs. As Kennedy said, we did them because they were hard. That required that there be national credit, and that produced productivity growth of the sort we desperately needs now. We essentially have a 21st century economy in which simple labor productivity growth has been very, very slow. So-called technological productivity growth or total factor productivity growth has been negative throughout the 21st century. We're going nowhere without this kind of directed credit for missions of advancement that this country has been known for in the past. So, um, what I was trying to get at before is we have to do these on an international scale now and in cooperation with exactly those other major powers that our current government is trying to demonize.
Let me just say, William,
I
go
agree
ahead.
with you. I agree with you that productivity is the key. Unfortunately, government is very unproductive. I lived in Boston for 2 years in the 1980s when they had what they called the Big Dig, which was the reconstruction of the Southeast Expressway. The federal government poured billions into that. There was cost overruns. There were project delays. There were corruption. It was a big mess for years, and they bled the taxpayers dry because of that public works project. And that's just one example of many.
Well, I would say it doesn't have to be that way, but we have to end this discussion. One area where I think we all might agree, aside from the ending of the Federal Reserve, although not what to do after it, is that some of the people involved in these very corrupt and shady deals should actually be prosecuted. The fact that there have not been indictments for people running all kinds of insider trading, monopolies, it's very hard to restore trust if nobody goes to jail, if nobody is confronted with their crimes. And we ran into this some years ago. Someone asked Eric Holder, Obama's attorney general, how was it that you had this big crash and all these banks going under and somehow not one single big banker ever got indicted or went to prison? And Holder's answer was, of course we can't do that because the whole system would crash.
Right.
So, it is a big part. This question of trust, what's the basis for trusting the government, and how do you ensure that it does have the consent of the people? And that is the point. People have to be involved and informed, and not just whipped from one emotional, hysterical, partisan craziness to the other. So I'd like to really thank both of you for participating. I'd like to do this again. We need these kind of debates and disagreements. Um, obviously, I am a Hamiltonian, LaRouchian. We need a national bank. We need credit. We need a robust government, but not a gigantic bloated bureaucracy of EPA and NEA and all of this other garbage that's tied us down. So thank you both very much.
Thank
And
you.
Yep. Pleasure.
we'll do this again soon. And William, I'll see you tomorrow in
Very
Kingston.
good. Look forward to it.
Great. All right. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And if we don't have a thermonuclear war between now and next Friday, I'll see you next week.